Hello everybody. It's the bearded geographer here. I know it's been a while since I've uploaded a video, but I thought I'd try and get back into it because it's good to see in some of the comments that my videos are proving to be quite helpful for some people. Also, kind of hoping this will be useful for my own students as well. Just to get rid of all doubt, I am a geography teacher. Please don't doubt that. And I'm also an examiner as well, so see a lot of these papers in my time. So I'm going to have a go at doing a walkthrough video here of my school's own mock paper. So some of these questions, these questions are not official AQA questions, but they are styled like that. And what I'm going to do, just to keep the videos a bit shorter, is just cover sections individually rather than the whole paper. Now, I just want to make it clear that the purpose of these videos is not to give you the answer. There's no point in that. It's to talk you through how to pick apart and understand the questions. Because there's no point in me giving you the answer because I don't know what questions are going to come up in the next proper GCSEs, but what I can give you is the skills and the knowledge that come from listening to someone who knows what they're talking about going through the questions. So just bear that one in mind. Some of the language I will use is related to my own school and the way they teach things, or the way we teach things, but I will try and relate it to everybody as much as I can. So I'll go through some questions quite quickly, but I'm hoping the pen will work. And here we go. So, first question. Which of the following is not a condition needed for a tropical storm to form? Not a condition. So the answer here is this one. Okay, it's D. Questions that are quite unclear do come up in the GCSEs. What you've got to think about with this one is that, okay, the actual temperature is around 26 to 27. So this is false because that there would indicate that anything between 20 to basically 20, probably not 25, but 20, not 26, 25. That would indicate that anything between there is warm enough for tropical storm formation. That's incorrect. So that there is D. So think about your process of elimination, thinking carefully as you go through these multiple choices. Okay, next. So here we are being asked to label the eye of the storm. So we know that the eye of the storm is the centre, so it is there. That is our eye. Now, what you've got to be careful with is being too quick with ones like this. So I know a lot of my students did this. Now I know what they mean by that, but in an actual exam that might not be allowed because it could be argued that that also includes the eye wall, which is the edge of the eye. So I guess the moral of the story here is to label as clearly as you can. Don't rush these. These kind of questions you should really be getting. AQA love a gap fill more than you would think. You might think to yourself that these are quite sort of key stage 3, but no, AQA do like a gap fill. So whenever you get something like this, it's all about taking your time, reading the information in the figure. And I always say to my students, whenever you do get a figure like this, I'm going to write it, just stop and take a breath. Just stop and take a breath. Because what happens is students will quickly glance at the figure and they will either misinterpret it or worry, or they'll miss something. Okay, so take a breath, take a second, read the thing, and you'll be able to see the answers beginning to appear. So I'm not going to give you the answers here because you can do that yourself, but just bear that in mind. Okay. Right, first kind of extended answer question, I guess you could say. So using figure 3, which shows us the locations of tropical storms around the world, we have to describe the distribution of these tropical storms. Now, when you see the word distribution, you're thinking there, you've got to think about this, okay? Think about this when it comes up. Where most and least. Where most least. And that can give you an idea of how to answer the question. Distribution is about where something is. You've got to understand that key word to then understand what the question is asking. What it's asking you to do is describe where we find tropical storms. And then through that, you then say, where do we find most and where do we find least? So you've got to understand that and think about that for all of your distribution questions. And just remember as well, what you're looking for here fundamentally is patterns. And finding patterns, more than anything, is actually natural. Humans have got a natural knack for finding patterns. But to help yourself, look at the figure. So we can see that the red is 3 or more storms per year. So we can see clearly we've got 2 areas of red. We've got the East Pacific, and then we've got East Asia here. So that is your most. You've got the East Pacific and you've got East Asia. So then you're making that point. I can see most tropical storms form from figure 3 in the East Pacific and in East Asia. Done, tick. Move on. So then we're looking at, well, where do we find least? And least we can see form around these areas, which are in yellow. So we've got the Southwest Pacific and we've got South Asia. So then you're making the point with least, I can see that least of them form in the Southwest Pacific and then in South Asia. And that's it. Because all you're doing, the command word here, is describe. You're not explaining it. With a describe, all you're doing is saying what you see. You're just saying what you see. I can see most form in the East Pacific and East Asia, and least form in the Southwest Pacific and South Asia. Done, dusted. Nothing more than that. So slow down, understand the keywords, and it'll help you out. Okay, now this question, I'm not a big fan of. As I said, these are not official AQA questions, but this question is a little bit unclear. But still, we can work with it. So we've got figure 4, which is a line graph showing changes in temperature for the northern hemisphere. So if we think about our world, equator, we've got the northern and the southern hemisphere. So we have got temperature change for the northern, the southern, and then a global average temperature change. And then we've got from 2000 up to basically around about here, and basically everything from there is a prediction. So just have that in mind, okay? And then all you do is work through the questions or the statements, but being clear that it's asking for what is false. Okay. Now the actual answer for this question, I could tell you, for us in our school, is that one, because if you look at the southern hemisphere between 2030 and 2040, in 2030 it's there, but in 2040 it's there. Okay, so it actually does go down. Now I'm not a big fan of the question because it's not really that clear, but again, you know, you do get unclear questions in exams, so break them up, take your time with them. So yeah, there you go, that's that one. Right, we've got here a nice run of 2 markers. We can really work with these a little bit. So let's have a look at the first one. Okay, outline 1 human cause of climate change. So we are thinking here, outline is our command word. Now, outline is basically a hidden explain. It's basically just wanting to explain human cause of climate change. So, then we've got 2 marks. So for that, we are thinking about things like industry. You could talk about farming. You could talk about power. Okay, so many things you could talk about there. And it's a hidden explain. So for my students, I would describe this as you need an evidence and then a comment. But if you're not one of my students, you might know this as point explain. Okay, so you need one of those. So how does power lead to it? How does industry lead to it? How does farming lead to it? Okay, here, this is an interesting question to work with here. So we have got describe. Okay. Now I actually think this is more of an explain question, but that doesn't matter. 1 factor that affects hazard risk. The reason this is an interesting question because of this is because of this hazard risk. Now, if you do not know what hazard risk is, this question is completely locked. You will struggle to get marks here because you don't know what hazard risk is. So what you have to think to yourself in your revision is, are you covering the key terms and the key words? Because fundamentally, if you do not know what these key terms mean, a lot of these questions will simply be locked. So you can't even really guess them. So that's why revising your key terms is so important. So hazard risk for us, okay, is the chance, it's basically the chance of being affected, I have to mind my handwriting, by a natural hazard. So it's the chance of being affected by a natural hazard. So when you know that, the question then opens itself up to you a little bit. You can unlock it slightly because you know what that key term means. So then you're saying to yourself, right, okay, well, factors that can affect hazard risk include your location. For example, you might live near the coast, or you might live near a river. Okay, both leave you more at risk of flooding. Or you might live in an area of poverty, so you don't have the money to be able to properly prepare for natural hazards. Or maybe you live in an area of high population density, so there's more people, there's more risk of being affected by a natural hazard. So bear that in mind as well. And similar here, I mean, I guess here a point explain would do the job. Okay, and the same can be said for this one. Okay, so we've got outline again, our hidden explain. And what you have to understand is what protection means in AQA geography. So we know that protection for us is basically taking steps to actively, pen's going a little bit, actively sort of guard against natural hazards. So this is different to monitoring and prediction and planning, because this is, for example, building earthquake-resistant buildings with things like shock absorbers, or maybe shutters over the windows so they don't shatter and hurt people, or maybe what's the one? Mass dampeners in the top of the building to stop the sway from happening too much. Okay, so this is another example of how if you understand that key word, the question is then unlocked and you can attempt it. So in your revision, do take time to revise those keywords with your textbooks and stuff. Okay, so here we've got a 6 marker, slightly more happening here, so just take a second to have a look. Now remember what I've said to you before, take a breath. Take a breath and read it. There isn't actually that much happening on this map. So you've got different plate margins with different icons. So we can see here that this is a constructive. We can see that that up there is a destructive. And we can see that there is other, but for us that is a conservative. And then we've got active volcanoes basically all over the map. And then we've got the names of plates. Okay, so we've got that. Okay, we know that. So looking at the question then, so we pick it apart. And we ask ourselves this. Let's have a look. So using figure 5, we have to explain the processes taking place at different plate margins which can lead to earthquakes and volcanoes. So you've booked your command word. So you've boxed your command word. You've underlined the keywords. Right. Let's pick this apart a little bit. So the processes for us are basically what's happening. Okay. So you've got to be able to explain what is actually happening at these boundaries, at these margins. Now we know the margins link to this up here. Okay, it's a shocking error. There we go. And we can also see that we've got earthquakes and volcanoes. What that tells us, okay, it's a little bit of a tip from the examiners. What that tells us is that if you do not cover both earthquakes and volcanoes, you will not get full marks. Okay. So once we've picked apart this question a little bit, what we've actually got is something very simple. Explain how earthquakes and volcanoes form. Include the figure. Right. So with a question like this, it is very, very rare that your weight needs to be balanced. What I mean by that is you don't need to give an equal amount of writing space to each side. More often than not, you can be unbalanced. So you can go really into detail on earthquakes or volcanoes, but then cover the other one in just a little less detail. You've got to include the figure. Now that is easy here. So let's say you're quite confident with shield volcanoes. Okay. So you are good with shield volcanoes at constructive margins. If that's where your confidence is, then that can be your really weighty bit of the answer. So that's where you're then going into the, right, firstly, the plates are pulling apart, due to slab pull, convection, so on and so forth. Secondly, magma rises up through the ridge, the gap formed. Thirdly, the magma cools into new rock, which eventually rises up from the sea. Finally, this forms a shield volcano. So you can go into your detail on your shield, and then you're thinking, right, well, then I've got to get earthquakes in. Now, earthquakes are pretty much, for GCSE, the formation is the same for whatever boundary you're on. The plates are moving towards or alongside each other, they inevitably get stuck and snagged. Tension builds up, and eventually the plates can't handle it anymore, and you will get that release of seismic energy as the plates jolt back into positions, and you get your earthquakes. The moral of the story with this question is it's quite easy to actually pick apart and figure out what they want. When you're using the figure, make it easy. So let's say you want to start off with your shield volcano. Okay, you literally just will put, I can see in F5, which is absolutely fine, figure 5, a constructive margin between the North American plate and Eurasian. Boom. You have used figure 5. Then you launch into your explanation. You've used figure 5, well done. So think about this. Whenever you get a figure, they are asking you to use it. They want you to use it. Okay? But you don't have to use it to achieve marks, but use it. Take your time, breathe, read it, and figure out what you know. But again, your revision here is important. Right, I think we're coming up to the last question and thus near the end of this little video. So, 110. To what extent does a country's ability to cope with the effects of a tectonic hazard depend on its wealth? Use contrasting examples to support your answer. Now, these questions can really throw people off, but you need to try and see through that. When you're thinking of these questions, I want you to think about a pyramid. As an examiner, I am giving marks for 1 to 3, 4 to 6, and 7 to 9. To achieve marks at the 1 to 3 level, it's actually quite open. It's actually quite straightforward. Okay? The mark scheme at the bottom of the level is quite generous, as long as you're on topic. The higher up you get, the tougher it gets, no doubt. But go into these questions with that mentality. Achieving 3 marks on a question like this is actually not that difficult if you've been revising and if you understand the question. So, let's have a think about it. I don't want to spend too much time on it because you don't need to. It kind of makes it more pressured than what it needs to be. To what extent indicates you need to give an amount. Now make it easy for yourself. Either be fully in agreement or partially. Easy as that. I either fully agree or I partially agree. Or vice versa. Disagree. Does a country's ability to cope depend on its wealth? So we're now thinking here, hic and lick/ni. And we need to give contrasting examples. Now for my students, that would be Italy and L'Aquila, and it would be Nepal. Now, we've now picked this apart, and what we can see it's asking is, do we think that a country's ability to deal with an earthquake or a volcano depends on how much money it's got? Explain. Now, I'll give you a top tip here. It kind of does. So, generally, wealthier countries can deal with earthquakes and volcanoes and hazards better. Okay? So that's the level you would go down. But with a to what extent, you always do want a little bit of balance. So you do this to help yourself out. So at the side of your paper, you might put a line, and you might be right, you know what, I completely agree. Yes, it does depend on wealth. So you start off with an agreement, a yes. So your first paragraph is, absolutely, it does matter. Going into Nepal, very poor country, the earthquake there caused untold destruction, and Nepal really struggled to cope. So that's your first paragraph. However, then your second paragraph might then be, well, actually, there are reasons why it doesn't depend on wealth. So that's when you might then start going into, well, the strength of the earthquake, you cannot control it. Or the location of the earthquake, you cannot control it. Or the time of day it strikes, or the amount of warning it gives you, you can't control it. So there are things that actually have got nothing to do with wealth. But then you finish off with a positive. However, actually, I do believe it is to do with wealth, because Italy, for example, their earthquake was handled better because of their wealth and access to well-trained emergency services and the ability to provide aftercare and rebuild and so on and so forth. If you can know clearly what your plan is to answer a question, then actually it becomes a lot easier to answer the question. And even something as easy as just as simple as that, just so you know where your answer is going to go, can really help. Okay? Because so often what we see in the exams is students who basically go off on tangents. There isn't really a structure. Okay, as I say, I'm not here to fully reteach the content to you. That's up for your teachers. But a couple of top tips on questions like this for your exam, from an examiner to you. Use paragraphs. Okay. It makes it easier for your examiner. And you want it to be easy for your examiner. Put in a conclusion or some kind of summary. It can help pick up a mark or two if it's lacking in your actual full answer, in the actual sort of application of knowledge and understanding. And if you're really struggling, honestly, bullet point. We can. It's a misconception, but we can mark bullet points. You may not get full marks, but you know what? You might pick up something. So, there we go. So hopefully this little video has been useful for you, and keep an eye out for, well, go on the channel for more content. But there you go. Thank you so much, guys, and I hope this was useful. Take care.